all our panelists coming from all around the world of accepting our invitation to participate. And now I will give the floor to Krishna Kumar, who will be sharing the session. Krishna is the Director of International Research at RAND Corporation. We met a couple of times. Krishna, thank you for joining. I know it's very early for you in the morning, so this is something that we appreciate a lot. Over to you, Krishna. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee for the pleasure and honor of moderating this panel, Inclusive Growth Agenda, a Modified Globalization. Few would dispute the claim that globalization has lifted millions of people around the world out of poverty and improved standards of living. Yet, few would also disagree that the gains from the process of globalization have been uneven in both emerging and developed economies. While inequality between countries has been falling, spectacular differences do remain among income when you look across countries. According to the IMF estimates, the per capita GDP of Qatar, adjusted for purchasing power parity, is nearly $130,000, a factor of 180 from the country at the other extreme, Burundi, with a per capita income of 724. Even when Burundi is compared with China, the poster child of globalization, rather than with the richest country, the factor of income is still 30, which is no less comforting. Convergence, the process by which poor countries catch up with the rich, was already slowing down, and COVID-19 is likely to worsen. So, for example, between 2000 and 2012, low and middle income countries grew at 6% a year, but in the few years following, it had already dropped to 4.5%. So such cross-country income gaps are likely to persist. Disparity within countries has also been growing. India, another country that has benefited from globalization, saw its Gini index go from 31.7 in 1993. This was a bit after its opening up, to 35.7 in this decade, according to World Bank estimates. Neither is an issue of disparity specific to emerging economies. During the height of globalization, the US middle class and poor economically stagnated or fell behind. For instance, between 1990 and 2010, the share of income accruing to the lowest quintile actually fell from an already paltry 3.8% to 3.3%. Indeed, the share of all the quintiles except the top went down. The top saw its share increase from 46.6% to 50.3%. Is it therefore surprising that there's been a rise in protectionist sentiment in many developed countries? The role of globalization in creating disparities might have been overemphasized. Technological change, education and labor market policies, social safety nets all play crucial roles, but the political economy of trade has always been tricky due to what Larry Summers calls the issue of invisible beneficiaries and highly visible losers. So if the developed countries do become more closed in response to political pressures, emerging economies will not be able to pursue their trade-driven growth ambitions. This will further slow down the process of convergence, which I briefly mentioned. The pandemic has decimated developed and emerging economies alike, making growth important for both sets of countries, first to recover lost ground and then expand their economies. At least in this sense, they've converged in their challenges, right? Existing disparities within countries have been exacerbated by the pandemic as vulnerable populations have been hit, both on the health and the economic fronts. This makes inclusive growth, which, to use a workable definition, the OECD characterizes as economic growth that is distributed fairly across society and creates opportunities for all, a critical issue for all types of countries. Policies that have been discussed for inclusive growth, such as better governance, equitable access to education, health, digital infrastructure, finance, as well as appropriate fiscal policies and safety nets, labor market policies, all these acquire greater urgency for a post-COVID-19 recovery. What is the future of globalization? Will COVID-19, which comes on top of a slowdown in global trade caused by the great financial crisis, be a knockout punch that causes developed countries to jettison globalization altogether? Or can it be a catalytic moment for the world that triggers a reimagination of policies and institutions to ensure that the benefits of globalization and growth get distributed more evenly? Will the trend towards regional rather than global trade agreements continue? Well, emerging economies such as Ethiopia, which hoping to emulate China's globalization wave, has been investing in manufacturing zones and infrastructure, be able to realize their aspirations in the global trading order that emerges. Which countries, regions, and sectors will win, which will lose in such an order? These are very weighty questions indeed, but then we are very lucky to have a distinguished panel that can guide us through them. Very quickly to introduce them, Gabriela Ramos is the Assistant Director General for the Social and Human Sciences of UNESCO, where she oversees the contributions of the institution to build inclusive and peaceful societies. And she has held leadership positions in the OECD prior to that. Felipe Larraín was Chile's finance minister twice, from 2010 to 2014, and in 2018 through 19. He was recognized by several prestigious publications as the best finance minister of the Americas and Latin America. He is currently professor of economics at Universidad Católica de Chile, member of the executive committee of the Latin American Center for Economic and Social Policies, and member of the Leadership Council for Sustainable Development at the UN. Sufyan Ahmed is highly experienced in macroeconomic and reform management, both in the capacity as Ethiopia's Minister of Finance and Economic Development and chairperson of the Ethiopian macroeconomic team from 1996 to 2015. Max Castelli is Managing Director, Head of Strategy, Sovereign Institutions at UBS Asset Management, and analyzes the market trends affecting the investment behavior of central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and other state-controlled investment institutions. And Rakesh Mohan was Executive Director of the Board of the IMF, Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and has held various other leadership and academic positions. He's currently the President Brookings in Economic Progress. As you can see, a remarkable range of experience and expertise to guide us. Given the number of panelists, each speaker will take not more than 8 minutes to present their opening remarks, which will leave us with a few minutes for discussion. So let's start with Gabriela Ramos. You might be on mute, Gabriela.
Indeed, that happens usually. Thank you, Krishna. It's a great honor to be here with you and with Mark discussing these very important issues. I feel that you put the finger on the core issues that we need to be debating on whether the growth model that was based on pursuing a very strong globalization through liberalization of trade and investment delivered for people. And I have to say that the answer is no. The growth and the benefits and all the very positive side of having this globalization moving and the opening of markets, of course, produced growth, of course, produced innovation, of course, produced the lifting of poverty rates in China, particularly. Let's be clear that it was about China, probably India in some regards. But the reality is that we really focus on globalization and trade as an end in itself and not as a mean to an end. The end should be increasing the well-being of people. The end should be that the distribution of the benefits of growth should be widely benefiting everybody. And what happened, as you mentioned, is that there has been a huge concentration at the top, because when we talk about inclusive growth, sometimes we hear people focusing on the precariousness, the non-standard contract that had been emerging from the digital economy, the informality, the lack of access to quality education of the most disadvantaged communities, or the lack of access to health that became so flagrant in the current crisis. But what we don't see, or what we are less eager to see, is the concentration at the top. And in a world in which 80% of the financial assets, and I'm glad that we have here Massimiliano with us, 80% of the financial assets are owned by the top 10 income earners in the US, for example, or where the wealth distribution is also 50 to 60 to 70% owned by the top 10 to 20% richest people in the world. while you have stagnant salaries and wages, not only for the low-income countries, developing countries, for OECD countries. And I was in charge of the Inclusive Growth Initiative in the OECD, and now I'm in charge of the Inclusive Growth package in UNESCO. The fact is that you have all these people that has translated their anger into political choices that have become very radical, and that is making governance impossible. So I think that the call is there, and it was there even before COVID. With COVID, what happens is that some groups are well prepared to wait the pandemic, and we have seen it again. Nothing wrong with the big platforms providing their digital services to keep the economy going and to keep ourselves discussing among each other. But if you compare, and this is a telling fact, the World Bank came out with analyzing the measures that governments were taking to protect people, social protection measures, and it equaled 880 billion. In the last months, that's exactly the increased earning of the platform economy. And therefore you wonder, are we just repeating this? What are the issues there? You mentioned very well, how do we ensure that there are opportunities for all? How do we ensure that the benefits of this impressive innovation drive reach everybody? But I would say that there is one element that also became very visible in the context of how badly prepared we were, everybody, to wait the pandemic, which is the retrenchment of the government duty of care, which is the more and more regressive tax systems and lack of investments, the fact that the capacities of governments have not been really taken care of. And I don't want to get into a discussion, because we always felt if you say that we need to invest in the capacities of our governments, you immediately become a socialist or you are against free enterprise, which is not the case. I think that the governments have proven all through the lifetime, and I was talking to Gabriel Zuckerman the other day, they have proven that when they are well endowed, when they invest in education, when they invest in infrastructure, when they invest in good regulations, and we know that with the digital economy, we need better regulations. It cannot be left to the free fall. When you invest in vaccines or in basic science for vaccines and don't leave it to the market, you might be better prepared. So I think this is a very important point that I want to put at the table. But I also want to put at the table that we need to change the growth model. We need not to focus on GDP and GDP per capita only as the measure of success, because this prevents you from reviewing the distribution of stocks. This is only a flow measurement, but the stocks in terms of wealth, in terms of natural resources, in terms of the depletion of natural resources and the sustainability of the growth process, you don't capture it. So in the OECD, but now in UNESCO, I'm continue to build the narrative and the tools to measure well-being, all the dimensions of well-being, to go beyond the averages and look for household income, disposable income, to focus on the bottom income distribution, and to really redress the kind of system that we have built, that I'm not a prophet. We're just in the middle of a huge crisis, and we were not prepared again. So these are my thoughts, Krishna.
Thank you so much, Gabriela Ramos, for emphasizing the concentration at the top and this very important point that you're making, which is balancing social safety nets and free enterprise. If time permits, we can come back to this, and the need for measuring well-being. Let us now turn to Felipe Larraín.
Thank you very much, Krishna. Thanks to Marcus Hahn for his invitation at the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee, and a pleasure to be part of this very distinguished panel. Let me share a few thoughts on the issue of globalization and echo some of the points that have been raised already by Krishna and Gabriela. It is clear that globalization has produced an increase in overall wealth, an increase in income, a dramatic reduction in poverty rates. It is also the case that globalization has produced anger, has produced people who are displaced. And there is an interesting point here in terms of the distribution, that in some countries and in many countries, we have a concentration of income, but we have on the overall different view if you look at the concentration of income within countries than you look at the overall distribution of income in the world. Because the fact that you have China coming in so strong, it reduces the inequality, overall, but it may increase inequalities within countries because you have those displaced by globalization. And I think one of the problems of globalization has been the fact that we have not been able to take care of those displaced by globalization. So who are those? The people who are threatened by competition, by technology, by trade, by the fact that we can now have different models. Technology allows to be producing in different countries and to have labor that comes into the productive process from many nations. And so that increases the competition for some groups who are, as I say, those displaced. If you add to that the fact that some industrial countries and several industrial countries are, calling least developed countries to open up their economies, but in the end, they are leaving their economies closed to trade. I think that is another very important point. It's an asymmetric call because you're asking someone else to liberalize, but you're not liberalizing yourself. And I think that is another part of the problem of globalization. We cannot forget, and it's part of the fact of life right now, that there is a trend towards greater protectionism, and whether that trend will stop or be reversed after the result of elections in the US is something that we are about to see. But if you see, for example, the protectionism between China and the US, the import tariff rates are close to 20% right now, and they were, a fraction of that in 2018. And you have confrontation between the US and Europe, and a trade confrontation. I mean, so it's not only about, maybe there is a wider trend. If you add protectionism and the pandemic, you see a very important decline of world trade. In fact, the WTO is estimating at the height of the pandemic, at the beginning, they said that world trade could decline by about 30%. Well, now their estimate is still double digits, but much lower than the 30% decline of world trade. So you have the setbacks, which is protectionism and the decline of world trade. You have trade tensions. You have a trend which is kind of a little worrying, which is the trend to reshoring. The fact that what we call reshoring is moving production closer to home, and that is certainly a deglobalization force, the reshoring. And it's partly as a fact of protectionism, partly as a fact of the pandemic, that you need to have your sources close to where you are. You have another force that I would also mention, which is the restrictions on migration in several countries. As a result of the pandemic, there are forces against migration because you want to preserve the jobs at home. So I think that is another part of the issue. There is also, I would not just mention the forces against globalization, would ask, that we deglobalize, but there are some forces that will be in favor of globalization, which is the increase of trade in services. And we are seeing a very dramatic rise of the trade in services. Of course, trade in services is much lower in volume than trade in goods, but this is facilitated by distance work, and the pandemic has only exacerbated the ability to work from distance. But in the end, because of this economic recession that we're enduring, and because it is very skewed, the distribution of people who can work from distance, we will likely see an increase in inequality after the pandemic. So, and I think that is another force, and we cannot really say that this is really on globalization. It is fact that, you know, it is the pandemic that is forcing these inequalities to increase. So we will need to also beware of this, and it's going to be a factor that will increasingly be with us in the months to come. I would also mention, and to finalize, a few challenges, like the new technologies. You know, it's not just an issue of trade, it's an issue of technological dispute and technological rivalry. For example, in 5G, there will be another force, another important element that we will have to deal with. The automation, the change in the work, in the workforce, the change in the work opportunities, you know, are some works will be displaced by globalization, some type of jobs will be displaced, others, you know, and I think for those of us who are lucky and privileged that we can work from home and work from distance, like this conference that we are having now, it's a different world than those who need to be present. You know, at the time of a pandemic, they need to be present at the place where they can work. So I would say that is another issue. And let me just mention, in terms of the a couple of things to end up and wrap up. On the issue of regional trade agreements that you mentioned, Krishna, at the beginning, I think that we will likely see, if there is not a very important leadership role at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that we will likely see that if you cannot make progress on a multilateral basis on trade, that you will see more free trade agreements and more regional, bilateral, and you know, trade agreements among groups of countries or among a couple of countries that can join together. That is a force that in a way, it counteracts the fact that we see little progress in the overall movement of towards you know, reducing trade barriers. In fact, if you see the opposite happening, which is increasing trade barriers, then you will like to protect yourself with bilateral or regional trade agreements. My final point will be on the digital divide. The digital issue is a very fundamental one, and part of the inequalities that you will be seeing is a part of the fact that, you know, I was looking at you know, a few figures in terms of ability to work from home, you know, compared to the years of education, and the people who have you know, tertiary education, higher education, you know, an overwhelming majority can work from home. Those with very low levels of education are very unlikely to be working from home. So I would say full access to digital services is, I think it's a must that we need to consider and need to be working for if we need to bridge this gap. You know, we won't bridge it completely because the nature of some works is more attuned to be performed at a distance, you know, but at least that everyone has access to digital services. And I think that's a very important challenge that we have in front of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe, for those remarks, especially drawing attention to people not being taken care of or displaced by trade, that particularly applies to developed countries. But then protectionism can hurt emerging economies and the various trends towards inequality, but maybe still leaving us with a little bit of hope that increase in trading services and maybe regional trade agreements can resuscitate some of the trade. Next, we have Sufyan Ahmed, please.
Thank you, Krishna. Thank you, Mark, for inviting me. I am very happy to be part of this panel. My comment will be really from the perspective of Africa, particularly from sub-Saharan African countries. Before the onset of the COVID pandemic, sub-Saharan Africa economy was showing a sign of recovery with a projected GDP growth rate of around 3% for 2020. Poverty was on a declining trend. There were upward trends in access to education and health services, as well as skill development, while fertility rate continued to fall. Similarly, implementation of pro-poor strategies, faster urbanization, some progress in digital development contributed to youth participation in the economy and enhancing inclusive growth. But following the disruption caused by the pandemic, the opportunities to build upon some of these modest gains achieved in the past decades were dealt a big blow. At the macro level, the setback is manifested in the big contraction of economic activities in sub-Saharan Africa. Recent estimates show that the sub-Saharan Africa GDP will contract by 3.3% in 2020. The extent of the regression is better captured by what is happening to per capita income. According to the World Bank estimates, sub-Saharan Africa real GDP per capita in 2021 is projected to fall to a level witnessed in 2007. Such a backsliding will hit the poor the hardest, thereby worsening inequality. COVID has impacted millions of jobs in Africa. The impact is most severe on the informal sector, where lockdowns and the partial closure affected industries such as retail, food, tourism, transport, and manufacturing, where most of the poor and the women are highly represented. This shows how the pandemic was able to reverse within a short period of time most of the gain made inclusive growth over the past decades. The pandemic has also placed a heavy burden on sub-Saharan Africa's sub-Saharan Africa's weak healthcare system, exposing further that pandemic preparedness is generally deficient. Health infrastructure and the healthcare delivery system were already inadequate and under great pressure. With respect to trade, what was seen as a limited but still promising progress in the pre-COVID Africa in integrating the continent into global value chain was another victim of the pandemic. Sub-Saharan African economies were hard hit by the collapse of the world trade and the fall in global demand for commodities, further eroding gains made in the support of inclusive growth. Commodity exporting countries' limited capacity to counteract the price shock with fiscal response was another big challenge. COVID's impact on the loss of income on livelihood can be starkly seen in the tourism sector. Almost universal travel restriction implemented across countries around end of April 2020 led to sudden stop in the major source of income for many African economies. Several countries on the continent being heavily reliant on tourism, many jobs and livelihoods were lost as a result. The devastation on the tourism sector may yet be the largest erosion in source of inclusive growth in the area of COVID pandemic. Remittance. While remittance constituted a major source of income for many families in sub-Saharan Africa, the projected 23% decline in remittance flows in 2020 compared to the year earlier will weigh heavily on human development. The role of remittance in developing countries is attested by the magnitude of these flows compared to the size of their economies, representing roughly around 10% of their GDPs. Another impact is really on food. Food crisis has emerged as the major threat to the recovery effort of sub-Saharan Africa from COVID. There are currently more than 113 million chronically food insecure people on the continent. Poor weather conditions, flooding, and the recent locust invasion are compounding the food shortage. The reduction in agricultural production is exacerbating a food shortage. This has intensified the evolving food crisis, and the food insecurity is really spreading much more widely. While the sustainable solution for inclusive growth requires expanding employment opportunities as well as raising the productivity level, in the short to medium term, government should also place enough emphasis on income distribution to arrest further deterioration in the livelihood. Use of social safety net program, nutrition program, use of early warning system to identify the needy and provide timely support will be critical. Expansion in digital technologies and putting in place adequate digital infrastructure will help to mitigate the kind of loss of learning witnessed in Africa, where more than 250 million students could not participate in regular education due to travel restriction and school closure. That will have really a serious impact on education sector in Africa. Sub-Saharan African countries face increased vulnerabilities in access to financial market as well as exposure to increasing financing costs. While government's deployment of available fiscal space and monetary easing was instrumental in economic stabilization, there is a long way to go before full recovery to achieve. Meeting the associated large financing needs will be the biggest challenge in the context of large current accounts and the fiscal deficit, and most importantly, heavy domestic and external debt burden in most of African countries. Finally, at the international level, we have witnessed how the capacity of government to respond to the crisis vary greatly, with African economies at a disadvantage in terms of available fiscal space. Recognizing that the world will not be safe unless the virus is defeated globally, it is in the interest of both the developed world and the developing countries to collaborate in ending the pandemic. For this to happen, advanced countries' assistance to poorer society is critical. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sufyan, for the perspective from Sub-Saharan Africa. This bind that we see ourselves in with the decrease in GDP and income, and yet the need for financing to address social safety nets, public health systems, as well as the effect the pandemic has had on the continent, especially highlighting areas like tourism, which we don't immediately think about, but because of travel restrictions have really wreaked havoc on inclusive growth within and across countries. Next, we have Massimiliano Castelli.
Thank you, Krishna, and thanks to Mark and the organizer for having me. What I would like to do in the next few minutes is that to mention something that I've been working over the last few months for a UBS conference that we had in September, where we prepare a paper called, together with, of course, some of my colleagues, but also together with Arturo Bris, who is a professor in IMD, the Lausanne Business School. And actually, the title of the paper is already in part explain what I would like to talk about it, which is, we ask ourselves, will globalization survive COVID-19? And I have to say that when we started writing the paper, we were pretty gloomy about the future of globalization, because of course we were looking at the impact of the pandemic, But the more we dig in and we look into the different aspects of the globalization, actually our conclusion is that we think it will survive, yes, but it will be different, first of all. And most importantly, there will be winners and losers. Now, why is it important for the debate that we are having in? Because I believe that the question of income disparity between countries and within countries, probably most importantly, and the question of who is going to do better or worse in the future, and so the whole question of inclusive growth, needs to take into account where globalization is heading. What type of globalization are we going into? Because that's the only way then to eventually introduce some adjustment to the globalization that we experience. And in fact, I mean, if you look at the period of globalization, what used to call hyper-globalization, which started around the 90s, actually ended already well before COVID-19. It actually ended in 2008 and 2009 with the global financial crisis. Since then, we enter a period that has been called in different ways. The one I prefer is probably the one labeled by the Economist, which call it the globalization. In fact, we had a drop in international trade. We had a drop in global capital flows. We also had a drop in immigration flows following the great financial crisis. In addition to that, we start to have the winds of nationalism blowing around the world. And for instance, opposition to migration. And we have to be clear, this is not just about advanced economies. We also had the opposition to migration in emerging markets, which to a large extent, one might argue, are probably the largest beneficiary, if you want, of the immigration in terms of searching for opportunities at the global level. Of course, the most important is that the China-US relationship deteriorated dramatically. And now we read everywhere about decoupling. And the concept of US-China decoupling is no longer a risk scenario. It is the reality we're living in. And you see that from any part of the conversation, from a political level to the economic level, trade, of course, financial, things about the opposition to capital flows from China, et cetera, et cetera. But we're also experiencing some important change. For those like me who are old enough to remember what the Washington Consensus is, I remember a few years back, protectionism was a sort of a taboo word. Nowadays, protectionism is considered as a legitimate policy. And I would say that also the Washington Consensus is no longer dominant around the world. We don't know yet what will replace it, but for sure, definitely the Washington Consensus is living a period of crisis. Now, a decade after the great financial crisis, which hit globalization, now we are experiencing another crisis, the COVID-19. Of course, it is a different type of crisis because its economic carnage in reality is caused not by some event in the financial sector, but actually it's an induced a recession by governments who needs to fight the pandemic. What is for sure is that this recession is going to be even larger than the one we had in 2008, 2001. It is pretty incredible when I look at the IMF table of growth. There is no one country in the world growing positively except for China. But I believe that also in China, growth rate of 2% after years of a very high growth might not be a recession, but at least will feel like a recession if you look at more granularly across the Chinese economy. Now, the evolving geopolitical situation following the great financial crisis has been, for me, a very important factor behind what happened to open the door to globalization. So the big question is, will COVID-19 accelerate even more globalization and eventually push the global economy into a fully fledged deglobalization, which basically means a drop in global trade, so negative growth in global trade, not just a slowdown, of course, after the terrible 2020, but we all know that eventually international trade will recover once the pandemic will be put under control, a serious carb into global capital flows, so drop in FDI, and of course, in terms of immigration. I think it is fair to say that we are moving towards a different model of globalization. I feel a little bit different in terms of what has been mentioned about regional trade. I personally think that we are moving towards a new type of globalization, which is going to be very much regionalized. We are probably going to have three main blocks, one centered around the US, one centered, of course, around Europe, and another one centered around China. So it's very likely that we are going to see three main blocks competing between them, with the free movement of capital, people, and labor in terms of within the blocks, but maybe more protectionism of one block against the other. So from that point of view, this is for me a very intriguing question, how this will play out in terms of income disparity and the losers from globalization. Will this new type of globalization be more conducive to policies which help within the region to alleviate poverty? Well, actually, if you think about it, this is well possible. Think about Europe integration and what's happening with the European Recovery Funds, which was unthinkable before. And now we have a principle where European countries, the richest one, tend to help the poorest one. I can see the same happening within other regional blocks around the world, for instance, in the Americas or in Asia, with, of course, different countries as a key driver, the US and eventually China. The other point I would like to make is that the actual slowdown in globalization is largely due to the rise of technology. And this is very important because this is a trend which whatever we are going to do will not go away. This is something that there are few things which economists and politicians eventually can control, but I don't think one of them is technological development. This will go ahead regardless of the policy that we are going to implement. So from that point of view, it's very important because technological process, especially in the first phase of globalization post-war period, has been very much helping globalization. Instead, in the post-hyper-globalization periods, because of the shift from manufactured goods to services, or if you want, in a more elegant way, from tangible to intangible goods, in some way impacted negatively globalization. So from that point of view, I would say that we are going to see more and more of that, and COVID accelerated that. So it is fair to say that technology will continue to have an impact on globalization and put some brakes on globalization. So if I can sum up sorry if I make a sort of a historical sort of analysis of globalization, but I think it's very important. So driven by technological change, tariff and populism, what we've seen is that two of the three pillars of globalization have already been in decline. Free movement of people and goods. The big question is about free movement of capital. I work in a bank. I see that still portfolio flows, for instance, have not been impacted negatively from deglobalization, but for sure, in certain countries, for instance, foreign direct investment has definitely been impacted. Think about Chinese investment into Europe and the US, and vice versa. You're seeing much more control about who invests what, and this is largely due to political or geopolitical reasons. Now, it is from this point of view, what we also did in the paper, we asked ourselves if the world is moving into this type of framework, which is a different type of globalization, who are going to be the winners and the losers? And now the question is interesting because in order to do that, we analyze basically which countries are more exposed to, let's say, global factor and which one are relatively more exposed to country factors. And I think that this will determine going forward who are going to be the loser and the winners. And we believe, based on this analysis, that the countries which will be more successful are going to be the countries which have stronger institutions, so that they will be able to build a social consensus around policy. And here I don't mean only economic policy. We are talking about health. Think about the policy that we are seeing around COVID. Think which countries have been able to succeed. The countries in Asia largely were able to create a very strong consensus on how to fight the pandemic. Which countries have been failure? The one which have not been able to build a social consensus, US, and I would say many European countries. The second categories of countries which are going to do relatively well are the small economies, which are able to enjoy the protection of a very large market, being them China or Europe. is actually very interesting. If you look at the IMD competitiveness report, most of the most competitive countries are very small, both in the emerging market world and in the developed world. So one really wonder why. And I believe that is because probably from a society point of view, this economy can be run in a more effective way. It is much easier to create consensus in a small country rather than in a country very big like the US, or even countries like India, or large countries like in Europe like Italy or France or Germany. And the third factor, which I'm surprised that Thatcher has not been mentioned so far, it is about the countries which have healthy finance, who can support the domestic economy dealing with the most devastating crisis of the last decades. So let me finish by saying that I believe, and I like very much the Gabriela remarks at the beginning, because she pointed out that the problem of income disparity and wealth concentration is definitely the challenge of our time. So, and the question is, what can be done about it? I believe that we are moving into a different type of globalization where regional policy, particularly regional integration, will play a much important role. And I believe that that will allow to implement this policy which tend to protect the losers, being the one who lose their job because of the pandemic, or the one who lose their job because of technological innovation. But what will become even more important will be also the consensus that is going to be built between these three regional blocks. And from that point of view, it is actually, I really hope the multilateralism and cooperation, starting from the vaccine distribution and of course the health sector, will gradually expand to cover other areas, climate change, and of course the social cohesion as well going forward. I stop here in the interest of time.
Thank you so much, Max, for drawing attention to decreasing immigration flow, and also that it's not a trade slowdown. It could be a contraction, talking about the regional trade. This, of course, begs the question whether there are going to be just rich clubs and poor clubs talking within each other, not across them. The technological change, which has been mentioned quite a few times, and then charting out the winners and losers in a historical context. So this leaves us, a few minutes for a couple of questions to see what you all think. And many of you touched upon this, the need for both, state and free enterprise. We want innovation, we want growth, but at the same time, we want better safety nets, which many of you mentioned if particular segments of society are going to be hit very hard. So there's a need for state as well. Do you see trade-offs between inclusion and growth, incentives and redistribution, if you will? Or is this a time where actually both can work together? What are your thoughts? Really, anyone who wants to jump in, and then we can go around.
Maybe I can chip in, because actually still at the OECD, I produced the Inclusiveness Productivity Nexus. Because in the way you are framing the question, it seems that there is only one way to grow. And the way to grow is to reallocate production factors in a way that you maximize production. But there you are considering a very limited set of factors, because the reality is when you have a large group of kids that cannot increase their level of scholarity, or that have to drop from schools, or you have informality and you have workers that we do not invest in their skills, or the SMEs that are always in a very precarious situation because they don't have access to financing, or the digital world that is really claiming for very high level skills and strengths to participate fully, you are missing a lot of very good contributions for a more inclusive growth. Just think about a very telling example, women and gender. When I was in the G20 at the Sherpa level, everybody was saying, what are the new sources of growth? And it was 2014. It's very telling that we are 3 times worst case scenario. We never thought it was going to be so hard. But the fact is that everybody was saying, what are the new sources of growth? And how can it be that in the context of the most impressive innovation age, not only because of the widespread tools, but also because of the speed, productivity is flat in so many economies. And the fact is that the reality is that you have these other elements that we are not considering for contributing to it. And I said, why don't we look at gender? Why don't we look at women? Of course, all the other Sherpas look at me like, what are you talking about? Let's be serious. No, I said, I'm being serious, because all of the countries have invested massively in education of girls. Every country, everything, even those that don't grant equality in the law for women, have invested massively in the education of their girls. So if you don't have them coming forward to almost see it as a return to investment in the labor market, because you have gaps that goes from 7% gap in the labor participation for women, between men and women in Canada, to 35 in Mexico, to 45 in Saudi Arabia, to 30 average. You're missing that 30% participation. And that gives you, at that time, to 2014, where we were growing below 2% global growth, it gave you 2 percentage points additional. So I feel we need to reframe the way we consider GDP. And that's why I feel that we should go for a more finer tools. We need to measure what we treasure, as we say, and not treasure what we measure. The GDP is a good comparative tool, very well used with historical series, that's fine, but it's not the only thing. We need to go to look at how people are faring, and a multidimensional way of measuring it and looking at the distributional and sustainability issues is as important as, and then is in line with the SDGs.
Thank you. I would characterize a lot of what you're saying as investing in human capital broadly across men, women, across different sectors. So at RAND, we did a model of the US economy, and we found that any policies that were aimed at building human capital broadly conceived did not show this trade-off. You can both increase inclusion and growth. So thank you for that response. I just wanted to see if anybody else had, Sufyan, you were going to say something.
Yeah, thank you, Krishna. You raised the issue of growth and distribution. From African point of view, as you know, given the level of poverty in many African countries, also given the growth of rate of population, this is a young continent. Growth without economic growth at a faster rate, it is really impossible to reduce poverty significantly. So we in Africa, we call faster growth of GDP is in necessary conditions. Second, we also know that the type of the growth matter. In of course, everywhere, particularly in Africa, unless it is a broad-based growth that really affected the whole section of society, that will not be sustainable. It will lead to all sorts of social problems. So we emphasize on the type of the growth. Focus on agriculture, focus on rural areas where still the majority of the population live there. Give access to education, mainly skills, basic health services, invest in infrastructure, mainly in rural areas, connectivity. This is critically important. On the other hand, yes, there is always a section of society that will be affected. And then we should also have a sustainable safety net. So growth and inclusiveness, really, they have to go hand in hand, really, to reduce poverty in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sufyan. This echoes what Gabriela said as well, that inclusion is something worth in its own right, and it's going to increase well-being. And without that, all the other policies that can cause growth might not even go ahead with the social tensions and so on. Were you going to say something, Felipe?
Yes, just in terms of the growth and this inclusive growth, let me say that I think that what we desperately need now is a strong recovery of the economies, and can it be a virtuous circle? And I think it could be. It is not guaranteed that it would be a virtuous circle. It depends on what kind of growth we will have. But I am thinking that you desperately need to restart investment. Investment has been hit very dramatically during this downturn, during the recession, and you need to restart the investment. In most economies in the world, the overwhelming majority of the investment is done by the private sector. So you need a fiscal push and a fiscal investment package, but you need to make investments which are, as was mentioned before, like infrastructure investments that will be complementary to the private investments. And let me mention a couple of things where you, of course, you will need also to be able to get back people to work. And this is a big, big challenge. I don't see, unfortunately, I don't see a V-shaped recovery in employment levels. I see a very dramatic drop, then an increase in employment, but then not to the previous levels, and then a slower movement to recover what was before. So I think it should be with different incentives, geared towards employment investments that are, strong in terms of creating jobs. And I would also like to mention, to finalize, the issue of sustainable investments and investments which are, attuned to our objectives on climate action, mitigation, adaptation. We have a very important opportunity so that this recovery is climate friendly. And there are huge opportunities in alternative energy sources, which are sustainable, in terms of mitigation, in terms of adaptation, water, small-scale agriculture, resilient infrastructure. So I see that there are ways in which this could be an inclusive growth strategy. We need to take care of those who have been displaced by COVID, right. And we need also to have this strong push on investment, on private investment.
Great, thanks for bringing the public and private.
One quick word, nice. If I may, on this point, because I think it is crucial. I mean, it is interesting because I think Gabriela mentioned the role of government. Now, and it is true that we have been living in a world until a few years back where anything public has been considered negative for growth and everything private has been considered positive, which in some way has been a sort of a dogmatic view. In reality, we know that it's not like that. Now, what's happening with COVID, and I don't want to give example historically because there are so many that I don't need to do that. I'm sure that you all know the success story of government which contributed to growth in several parts of the world in our history. But what we're seeing now is that this sort of dogma has been completely wiped out from the COVID. Now the austerity concept is gone. Now here we are going to be in a very important turning point. As soon as the recovery will kick in, we will have to decide what type of fiscal policy we are going to do in both developed and in developing economies. Now the choice is, and that's already what Felipe alluded to, if we are going to have a policy which are aimed at subsidizing jobs, which we know that because of technological development will be wiped out anyway, if we are going to invest in polluting energy sources, we are going to protect big interests which we know that are not sustainable financially or economically, we are going to have a big mistake because we will wake up in a few years' time with a massive debt and low growth. So this is now crucial to implement a fiscal policy which touch upon all these issues the infrastructure, green technology, social inclusion, gender equality, raising the participation of women in the economy. If we are going to do this, and even if these require higher taxation, why not? If this higher taxation is going to be spent well, but if we are going to tax more income in order to subsidize sectors which are going to be clearly in some way declining, I think it's going to be very tough to reduce poverty afterwards.
Yeah, thank you, Max. And that brings very nicely to the motivation of the question, and a very positive way to end this, which is that maybe this can be the catalytic moment where we shed dogmas and see the interests of both public and private investment, and not see inclusion and growth as separate concepts, as many of you have mentioned, but integrally. And given that this is, after all, the series called Dialogue of Continents, and many of you have touched upon this as well, hopefully this is more a time where countries come together, emerging economies, developed countries, try to increase trade between them rather than just staying within separate groups. So on that hopeful and positive note, we are at the top of the hour, and back to you, Mark. I just want to say thank you to our panelists for an outstanding discussion. I think we've all benefited from your remarks. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Krishna. Thank you for all of you. I think a very good conversation. Thanks so much. In fact, the good transition will be that at 3 o'clock, we will be focusing primarily on emerging market and what I think Massimiliano mentioned related to capital flow, how we are going to finance post-COVID-19 recovery. So stay tuned, 3 p.m. For our next session with also a very good group of policymakers and private sector participants. Thanks for all of you, and looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.